I have told this story exactly once before tonight to a man whose name I have never written down in a room that officially does not exist, on a station that was decommissioned 3 years after the Kethara Accords were signed. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the table between us and said, "That is not the version in the record." I told him I was aware of that. He said, "Is the version in the record false?" I said no. He thought about that for a moment, and then he told me to go home and not tell the story again. I have respected that instruction for 11 years. He died in February, so the Kethara Exchange is not a place you find by accident. It sits in a system the older charts label uninhabited, which was accurate enough in the era those charts were drawn. Before the Conclave of 12 built their parliament there, across 4 decades, and several layers of commercial infrastructure that make the station itself look, from the outside, less like a governmental seat, and more like a very busy market that has forgotten it was ever anything else. Docking rings layered over older docking rings. HAB modules grafted onto commerce. Decks grafted onto the original frame, which was itself a converted ore platform from the Kethara moon mining concern that the Nava Trade Assembly absorbed in their second expansion. The whole structure is enormous and asymmetric and slightly grimy, in the way that buildings get when they have been functional for too long and no one has had reason to tear them down. It smells of coolant, lubricant, and waste heat, and the particular dry dustiness of recycled atmosphere run the same scrubbers for 20 years. I noticed it the moment I stepped off the shuttle, and I noticed it every morning after that, and by the 3rd day I had stopped noticing it entirely, which I took as a small warning about the other things in that building you could stop noticing if you were not deliberate about it. I arrived there on a shuttle from the Tis Resolute margin, was holding position at the outer edge of the Kethara system, with 3 escort frigates, and a signals intelligence package that had cost more than most planetary budgets. The shuttle was a nondescript courier vessel, unarmed, flagged under a commercial registry out of the Hestia belt. My credentials identified me as a junior trade advisor to Undersecretary Ellard Mossbank, the head of the human delegation. My real credentials were a good deal more specific, and a good deal less displayable. I am going to tell you what I was, plainly, because it matters. I was an intelligence officer. Naval Intelligence Outer Rim Division, though that title covers a considerable range of functions, and I operated at what my former supervisor used to call the uncomfortable end of that range. I had spent the previous 4 years doing what I will describe only as deep access liaison work, in systems where human presence was technically unofficial and occasionally technically illegal, depending on which signatory body's laws you applied. I spoke with varying degrees of fluency, 6 languages including 3 that no human being had spoken before my cohort of trainees. I was 31 years old. I had never fired a weapon at another living thing. I had, on 2 occasions, caused events that resulted in other people firing weapons, which I understood was worse and which I had thought about enough to have a settled, if not comfortable, position on. I want to be precise about what I was so that you understand what I was not. I was not a diplomat. Undersecretary Mossbank was the diplomat, quiet, careful man of 64, who had spent his career in the Outer Contact Bureau, and who had negotiated 11 separate framework agreements with 4 different non-human polities, all of them still in force, which is a record in the Bureau that has not been broken since. He wore plain dark suits and carried a battered leather folio everywhere he went, and had the kind of stillness that you develop after decades of sitting at tables where the wrong word could start a war. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He asked precise questions in precise language, and he listened to the answers in the same way I imagine a structural engineer listens to a building, not for what it says, but for what it tells you about what it is made of, and whether the load is being distributed correctly. I liked him. He was good at his job, and he knew what I was, and he had the professional wisdom to pretend that he did not. The delegation was 7 people. Mossbank, 3 trade specialists from the Commerce Ministry, a legal advisor named Trell who was the quietest human being I have ever met, and who had a mind like a scalpel, economical, unhurried, and capable of cutting through exactly the layer you needed cut without disturbing anything adjacent, A communications officer who handled the encryption, routing, and me filed in the manifest as administrative support. We occupied a modest suite of rooms on the exchange's diplomatic tier, which was separated from the commerce decks by 2 security checkpoints, and a noticeable drop in ambient noise. The rooms smelled of the same recycled air as the rest of the station, plus something faintly chemical that I was told was an atmospheric additive the conclave used in spaces where multiple species were expected to coexist. It was calibrated to be inoffensive to all 12 member species. It succeeded mostly by being inoffensive to no one in particular, which I thought was a useful metaphor for certain kinds of policy making, though I kept that observation to myself. I had read the conclave's charter before departure. I had read all 12 member species' public profiles, their internal governance records insofar as we had them, their military procurement histories, their commercial frameworks, their trade disputes going back 4 decades, and a significant volume of material that none of them would have classified as public. Want to be honest, by the time I arrived at Cathara Exchange, I knew things about those 12 species that I am still not permitted to describe in specific terms. I will say only that my knowledge of their military capabilities was detailed, that my knowledge of the origins of those capabilities was more detailed still, and that these 2 facts together were precisely why Mossbank had requested me specifically for this assignment. He had asked for me over the objections of 2 of his senior staff, who felt that an intelligence officer had no place at a commerce summit. Mossbank had listened to their objections with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then he had filed my assignment request anyway. When I thanked him for that, during our first briefing on the transit out to the margin, he looked at me with the mild expression he wore for most things and said, "I've been to the Cathara Exchange twice before. The second time, I almost didn't come home. I'd rather have someone who reads the room differently than I do." I thought about that for most of the transit from the margin to the station. Thought about it. The way you think about things that have more layers than they appear to. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a weight to be carried, and the carrying of it was its own kind of work. The conclave of 12 convened on the station's central level, in a chamber that had been purpose-built for multi-species deliberation. The room was larger than it needed to be for 12 delegations, which I suspected was deliberate. Space as a signal of permanence, of the weight of what was outside here. The table was not circular, surprised me. It was an elongated hexagon, with each face occupied by a delegation seating, the geometry engineered, so that each delegation had a sightline to every other, without any delegation being directly opposite any other. No head of table, no foot. The translation infrastructure was overhead, a network of emitter receivers that I could see if I looked up and that hummed at a frequency just below conscious attention, unless you were listening for it, which I was, because I find it useful to know where the information is going and how fast it is moving. 12 species produces 12 different sensory profiles, 12 different ergonomic requirements, and 11 separate translation passes for every spoken statement, since the only common tongue the conclave had agreed on was a trade pidgin called Catharan Standard that everyone spoke imprecisely and no one spoke. 12. It had a grammar that was a compromise between 5 different grammatical systems, and the result was something that managed to be ambiguous in 3 different ways simultaneously, if you were not careful. Mossbank spoke it like he had been born into it, the flat, careful precision that comes from knowing a language well enough to use it, without accent and imprecisely enough to avoid implying things you did not mean to imply. I spoke it well enough to understand what was being said slightly before the translation feed said it, which was an advantage that sounds minor until you were sitting in a room where timing matters. Humanity was not a member of the conclave of 12. We were present as a provisional associate, a status that meant we could attend, could speak when recognized, could not vote, and were bound by the outcomes of votes that affected our zone of commerce. This status had been established 6 years prior, through a separate framework agreement that Mossbank had negotiated, and it had been, at the time, understood on both sides as a step toward full membership. It had been intended as the beginning of a process. What I knew, and what Mossbank knew, And what the bulk of the human government did not yet officially know was that full membership was no longer the item under discussion. The item under discussion had changed. I had become aware of this shift approximately 8 months before the summit, through means I will not describe, and I had spent those 8 months accumulating everything I needed for the conversation I intended to have at the end of it. The conclave met in formal session for 3 days before the vote. I will not walk you through all of it, because most of it was exactly what commerce summits are: extended procedural negotiations about tariff structures, route exclusions, extraction rights in the Kethera Outer Belt, a dispute between the Navari Trade Assembly and the Dacic Combine over processing fees that had been running for 11 years, and showed no sign of resolution, a proposal by the Karenni Assembly for a new arbitration framework that everyone else had objections to and no one had counterproposals. Mossbank handled all of it with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. I sat in the secondary delegation tier, 2 rows behind him, and I listened and I watched, and I noted things in a pad that I kept in an inner pocket, and that was not connected to any network. The conclave's member species are worth describing because they matter to what happened, and because most humans have a simplified picture of them that does not capture what they are actually like to be in a room with. The Navari are the largest economic power in the conclave, and possibly in the accessible galaxy, depending on how you measure it and what you include. They are tall, gray-skinned, with a skeletal structure that makes their posture look, to human eyes, slightly wrong, like a person who has been assembled from the right components in a sequence that is nearly but not quite correct. Their faces are not expressive by human standards, and for a long time students of interspecies contact made the error of concluding from this that they were not expressive at all. They are. The expressiveness is in the hands and in the specific angle of the shoulders and in the degree of stillness. Because the Navari have a precise gradient of stillness that ranges from resting ease to absolute locked-in attention, and a trained observer can read the difference. If their decision-making is collective in a way that is not quite a hive mind, but is something adjacent to it. A Navari individual can act independently but rarely chooses to, because the social cost of divergence from consensus is, in their framework, genuinely high. The Navari representatives at Kethera sat in a cluster at the long table's far end, and when one of them spoke, they were silent in a way that felt coordinated without appearing coordinated, the silence of people who have already discussed what is going to be said. The Dacic are physically smaller than humans, faster moving, and louder. They are a merchant culture in the most literal sense. Trade is not merely what they do, but is embedded in how they understand relationships, hierarchy, and worth. A Dacic who is not engaged in commerce in some form is, in their cultural framework, not fully participating in society. This sounds abstract until you watch a Dacic negotiator work, which is an experience I would describe as sitting inside a machine that is running at a speed slightly beyond what you can comfortably track. They move fast. They process information fast. They speak over each other constantly in a way that is not rude by their norms. Because in Dacic communicative practice, the overlap of speech is a signal of engagement rather than interruption. The more people talking at once, the more alive the negotiation. Their 2 representatives at Kethera were the most active voices in the room for the first 2 days, and the translate lady overhead worked noticeably harder during their contributions. The remaining 10 species I will describe more briefly, because this account would otherwise run to volumes. The Sheth were the oldest civilization in the room, slow-spoken and patient, the kind of patient that comes from operating on timescales, where a decade is a short-term consideration, and where the definition of urgent and the definition of inevitable are nearly the same thing. The Vorok were predator-evolved and knew it, and had the posture of something that had decided, generations ago, to become civilized without entirely forgetting what it had been. They were not aggressive in session. They were careful, controlled, and precise in a way that predator-evolved species often are, when they apply the same focus they once used for tracking to the task of analysis. The Karenni were the smallest species represented physically, and had the most sophisticated legal minds I have encountered in any civilization, human or otherwise. Their legal advisor alone had a support staff of 9, all of whom were also lawyers. Karenni's view of law is not adversarial in the human sense. It is closer to engineering, a set of structures that must hold load without failing, and their approach to any agreement is to find every failure point before the structure is built. I respected this. It made them slow. The other 7 species I will name but not describe: Pelare, Ostakon, Drev, Hetan, Thuron, Mirik, Kalt, all of them commercial powers. All of them present at that table with interests in what happened next. All of them, at various points in those 3 days, discussed humanity in my hearing as though I were not there. This was partly a translation issue. The translation delay meant that secondary tier personnel were functionally out of real-time comprehension for most conversations, and the conclave members had long since adjusted their conversational habits accordingly. But mostly it was not a translation issue. Mostly it was that the provisional associate seating tier is far enough from the main table that the people at the main table have, over time, developed the habit of treating it as decorative. Mossbank had warned me about this before we arrived. He had said, "They will say things in front of you they would not say to you. Remember that. Do not correct them. Use what they say." I did not correct them. What they said over those 3 days was not unusual by the standards of what I had been reading for 8 months. It was the calculus of large powers confronting a smaller one, transactional, not hostile, operating from an assumption of outcome that was so settled for them it did not require emphasis. The Navari representative, Cassie Het, spoke on the second afternoon about the Terran zone's productive capacity in a way that mapped human output to a commodity column with the complete neutrality of a person doing accounting. It was not dehumanizing, it was category thinking, applied with the same consistency the Navari applied to every resource-producing entity in their sphere. In their framework, we were not being dismissed. We were being processed. There is a difference. It is not a comfortable one. The Dasek representative Orak Vass was more direct, as the Dasek tend to be. On the 3rd morning, in a side exchange with a Pelori delegate, that I was almost certainly not intended to hear, but heard, because I speak Ketharan standard faster than the translation feed, and because I was paying attention, Orak Vass used a phrase that translates most accurately as at the point of transfer when referring to the human zone. Transfer of what, to whom, was not specified in that exchange. It did not need to be. I knew what it meant. I had known what it meant for 8 months. On the 3rd morning I also noticed something smaller, which mattered more than the Orak Vass exchange. The Vorak representative, Kresh Tehran, had been watching the human delegation with the specific quality of attention her species uses for threat assessment. Not hostility, just calibrated alertness, the kind of watching that means you are filing information. She had been doing it since the first session. On the 3rd morning, during a recess between the tariff discussion and the formal vote items, she stopped doing it. She looked at the human table, and she looked away, and she did not look back. I noted that in my pad, something in her calculation had resolved. I did not know at that moment which way it had resolved. On the 3rd afternoon, Conclave Chair Savath called the formal session to order for the final block of business. The chamber settled. The translation feeds warmed. Mossbank sat with his hands folded on his folio in front of him, and he was completely still. Chair Savath is Sheth, which means she had been in governance longer than humanity had been spacefaring, which is not an exaggeration. She moved through the item with the unhurried precision of an entity that does not experience urgency in the way that younger species do, not because she did not understand its relevance, but because, from her timescale, urgency and patience are pointed on a longer spectrum rather than opposites. She outlined the proposal in Ketharan Standard with no preamble and no softening, a formal reclassification of humanity's associate status, provisional commerce associate to managed resource signatory. This category existed in the Conclave's charter. It had been used exactly twice before, both times for non-sapient resource planets. Was a fact I had noted when I first read the charter and which I had not discussed with anyone outside my division. The terms were detailed and specific and had clearly been drafted with careful legal assistance, because the language was the kind of airtight that does not happen without intent and review. Human territorial rights would be preserved. Human internal governance would be preserved. The human military capacity, and here the phrasing was careful, care phrasing of people who understood the Karenni legal staff, would be parsing it, would be administered within the joint oversight framework. What that meant, without the careful phrasing, was that it would be reduced to a level the conclave deemed appropriate, and the conclave would decide what appropriate meant, and that the decision would be backed by 12 navies and not subject to appeal. Mossbank's hands did not move. His face did not change. I looked at the room. 12 species, all 12 represented, in a chamber built for exactly this kind of moment. The Navari were still in the way. That means calculation completed, outcome confirmed. The Dosic were very slightly forward in their seats, not eagerly, that is a human red, but with the quality of attention that means a transaction is concluding as projected, and the focus is on the mechanics of close. The Voruk, Kresh-Taran specifically, was not looking at the human delegation anymore. She was looking at the chair. The Sheth were in the patient posture, the one that means the current activity is administrative confirmation of something already settled. Savith called the vote. 12-member species. Unanimous vote required for any action affecting a non-member associate. This was the Karenni drafted protection in the charter, the structural load-bearing piece that had been meant to give small associates a measure of security. Unanimous meaning everyone. 11 voted in favor. The 12th was the Sharon Compact, present as observers only, non-voting, Stein, known when I read the membership roster, which was part of why I had not been counting on the Sharon protection. They had observer status and no vote. And their representative had been avoiding eye contact with the Navari bloc since the first afternoon for reasons that I understood, and that would have been relevant in a different kind of meeting. Unanimous among the voting members. The motion carried. Savith announced it in the careful tone of a formal proceeding. She was specific about the margin and the effective date. She was specific about the transition timeline. 18 months for the initial compliance review. 36 for the full oversight transfer. She said that the human delegation would receive the formal instrument of transfer by the end of the session, that the delegation's government would have 60 days to acknowledge it, and that the acknowledgement was a formality since the instrument was self-executing under the terms of the original associate agreement Mossbank had signed 6 years ago in a meeting that had at the time felt like a step forward. She spoke for 4 minutes. She was not gloating. She was not cold, exactly. She was doing administrative work that happened to concern the future of my species, in the same careful voice she would have used for the tariff dispute or the processing fee arbitration. Mossbank still had not moved. I picked up the data chit from the inner breast pocket of my jacket, where it had been for all 3 days of the session. I looked at it for a moment. It was small, the size of 2 fingers, standard exchange format. Nothing that would identify its origin to a security scanner. I had carried it from the margin to the station, and through 2 security checkpoints, and into the chamber every morning, and I had sat with it in my pocket through 3 days of commercial deliberation, and it had never been warm enough to notice, and now I picked it up and I stood. This was not protocol. Secondary delegation personnel do not stand during formal session. The chamber noticed immediately. The translation feeds paused, which they do automatically when an unregistered speaker rises, and the pause itself drew attention the way a missed beat draws attention in music. 20 sets of alien eyes, in various configurations, turned to the provisional associate seating tier. I said in Catherine Standard, Delegate Vasquez, Administrative Support, Terran Delegation. I have a supplementary item for the chair's consideration before the session closes. There was a pause. The kind of pause that means multiple different cognitive systems processing the same unexpected input and arriving at the same preliminary conclusion. This was not scheduled. Savith said, the floor is not open to secondary delegation personnel during formal session. I said, I understand the item is brief, and I believe the chair and the full membership will prefer to have it before the formal record closes rather than after. The word after was the operative one. After meant, after the instrument is issued, after the record is sealed, after the thing is already official. Before was different. Before could be incorporated. After was messier, another pause, longer this time. I watched Savith glance at the Navari block, a brief exchange, the kind that does not need words in a partnership as established as theirs, and then back at me she said, "You have the floor for 2 minutes." I walked from the secondary seating tier to the main table. 8 meters, perhaps. The chair nearest the Terran delegation's main seat was empty. Mossbank's support staff were back in the suite. Only Trell and I had been in the chamber, and I did not sit in it. I stood at the edge of the table. I placed the data chit on the surface in front of Chair Savith, and I said, in my most precise Ketharan standard, "This chit contains a document I would ask the chair to share with all member delegations simultaneously. I would ask that it be reviewed before the transfer instrument is issued." Savith looked at the chit. She looked at me. Her species does not emote in ways I can read with complete confidence, but there was something in the angle of her posture that registered as deliberation, not alarm, not dismissal. Deliberation. She said, "What does it contain?" I said, "A production history." She picked up the chit. She interfaced it with the table's document system. The document propagated to every delegation terminal in the room simultaneously, which was what I had asked for and what the system was designed to do for official submissions. Even secondary tier submissions. Was a detail of the Karenni charter drafting that I suspected the Karenni themselves had forgotten. What happened next took approximately 12 minutes, measured from the moment the document appeared on the terminals, Taman, to the moment Chair Savith set down the data slate she had been holding and looked at me across the table without speaking. The document was long. I had spent 8 months compiling it and another 3 drafting it, and I am, by training and by disposition, a thorough person. It was organized by species, by weapons system class, by acquisition timeline, and by contractor chain. It was cross-referenced against procurement records that none of the species in the room knew humanity had access to. It cited original engineering documents, manufacturing contracts, and technical specifications in the originating language of each relevant system, translation appended. It contained 81 primary citations and 47 supplementary ones. It was, in plain terms, a complete accounting of the degree to which human engineering, human materials science, human propulsion technology, and human weapons design had, over the preceding 31 years, entered the military and commercial infrastructure of every species sitting at that table, under cover of trade, agreements, shell companies, licensing deals, intermediary manufacturing arrangements, and in 4 cases outright unattributed technical assistance that those species' own records described, incorrectly, as indigenous development. I had not built any of this. I want to be clear about that. The program predated me by 2 decades. It had been initiated quietly, through channels I was not briefed into, until my 4th year in the division, by people who understood something that the rest of the diplomatic corps had not yet fully understood when it began. That the galaxy was going to encounter humanity eventually. And that the condition the galaxy was in at the moment of that encounter would matter enormously, and that one useful answer to the question of condition was a galaxy whose most capable military forces were, in significant part, built on Terran origin systems that humanity understood better than the owners did. It was a long program. It required patience of the kind that is, frankly, rare in human institutions, which operate on electoral cycles and budget reviews rather than generational plans. The people who started it were not alive to see it matter. I have thought about that more than once. The Navari's preampical Kippel's main batteries, the Keldarat heavy rail system that had been the backbone of their fleet for 22 years, the system their tactical doctrine was built around, had been designed, in prototype, by an engineer at the Meridian Heavy Works facility on Callisto, working under a Navari subcontract documented as a materials consultation. Prototype drawings were in the appendix. The engineer's name was not, because including it would have been unnecessary and cruel, and whoever drafted the program's initial documentation had understood this. The Navari had believed for 22 years that they had developed the Keldarat system through internal innovation. The material in the appendix was specific enough that this belief was no longer sustainable. The drive cores of the Dacic fast attack fleet The ones that gave them the acceleration advantage they had used in the Pellery corridor disputes. The ones that were a point of significant national pride in Dacic commercial culture. Were fourth-generation derivatives of a Terran experimental drive program that had been sold, through a Heton intermediary, to a Dacic commercial entity that had then passed the technology up to their naval procurement office. The chain was documented in full, including the intermediary contracts, including the original Terran program designation, including the 4 separate technical handoffs by which the design had moved from its origin to the Dacic naval yards. The Dacic had believed that the drive core was the product of their own engineering excellence. Documentation suggested a more complicated provenance. The Voruk's Point defense grid, the system that made their warships nearly invulnerable to missile approach at standard engagement ranges, the system they had used for 40 years as the foundation of their tactical doctrine, and that had been a primary factor in their position within the conclave, was built on targeting algorithms that had been licensed as civilian navigation software for commercial shipping from a firm that no longer existed to a Voruk commercial partner that very much did. The licensing agreement was in the appendix. The technical relationship between the navigation software and the military targeting system it had become was explained in 3 pages of clear prose that I had drafted myself. Because the technical author of that section had written it in a way that was accurate, but would have required a specialist to follow, and I wanted the Voruk representative to be able to follow it in a conference room without help. And so on for all 12 species, in varying degrees of depth and directness. Some of the connections were thin. The Thuron entry, for instance, was a materials science licensing chain that affected one class of their sensor arrays, not a strategic system. Some were not thin at all. The Navari, Dacic, and Voruk entries were the most extensive, because they were the most capable military powers in the room, and the program's architects had apparently made the same assessment of priorities that I would have made. The document did not editorialize. It did not make threats. It did not contain a single line of policy recommendation or a single statement about what the conclave should or should not. It described with citations what existed. It was a production history exactly as I had told Savith. The interpretation was left entirely to the reader. I watched the room read it. The Navari went still first. They had always been still, but this was a different stillness. Not the composed stillness of an entity tracking a known situation, but the stillness of recalculation, of a model being rebuilt in real time. Cassie had read without moving for 4 minutes, then turned to the colleague beside her, and said something in Navari primary that I caught half of, and that was something close to the way a structural engineer talks when they have just found something in a load-bearing wall that should not be there. Not panic. Assessment. The Dacic were suddenly quieter than I had seen them in 3 days. Auric Vass, who had not been still for more than 30 consecutive seconds since the session began, was not moving. The translator overhead was idle for the Dacic table for nearly 2 minutes, which I had never seen in 3 days, and which, in that room, in that context, was more eloquent than anything the translation feed had processed. The Voruk representative, Kresh Turan, the senior one, who had been watching the human delegation with careful threat assessment attention, and who had stopped watching us on the 3rd morning, was reading the point defense section very carefully. I could see in the slight compression of her posture, the moment she reached the part that explained how the navigation software licensing had worked. She did not look up. She kept reading. Mossbank had not moved. His hands were still on his folio. He was looking at the table surface in front of him. I could not see his expression from where I was standing, but I knew that expression. It was the one he wore when he was recording something in the part of his memory where he kept things he would need later. Chair Savith finished reading. She set down the slate. She looked at me across the table. The chamber was very quiet. The translation feed overhead had gone into standby. There was nothing to translate, she said. This document claims to describe 31 years of technical transfer. I said, it describes what the record contains. I make no claims beyond that, she said. If this is accurate, I said it is accurate. There was a pause, she said. If this is accurate, then the Terran technical presence, in the military infrastructure of the member species is. She paused again. She was Sheth. They are careful with language in a way that comes from a long time spent understanding the weight of imprecision. She said, substantial. I said, that is one word for it. Across the table in Dasik Primary, I heard Auric Vaz say something I will not repeat directly, but that was approximately the expression of per person who has discovered, mid-transaction, that the item they believed they were selling belongs, in some structural sense, to the buyer. I said in Catherine Standard, I would also note, for the record, that the technical document currently in distribution has been verified against independent archives held in 3 separate locations, one of which is outside this system. The verification chain is documented in the appendix. In the event that the session record were to be modified after close, or the document's distribution were to be challenged on procedural grounds, verification chain would remain intact and accessible. I said this in the same tone I had used throughout. Not threatening, not hard, just informational. I was providing facts about the document's structural integrity, which was my right as the submitting party. Chersevith looked at me for a long moment. She said, Delegate Vasquez, I am going to call a recess. I said, of course. The recess was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I sat in the secondary seating tier. I did not return to the suite. I did not want anyone to have to decide whether to come to me, and I drank the tea that a Kareni administrative assistant brought me, which was not actually tea, but was close enough in character that the word seemed appropriate. The assistant did not speak to me while she set it down. She moved with the careful precision the Kareni bring to everything, and she left without comment. Mossbank came and sat beside me during the first hour. He set his folio on his knees and folded his hands on top of it and looked at the empty chamber for several minutes without speaking. The translation feed overhead was completely dark. The chamber held our breathing and nothing else, he said, very quietly. I would have liked a little more notice. I said, I know. I'm sorry. He said, are you actually sorry? I thought about it honestly, which he deserved. I said, no. He nodded. He said, good. A pause. How extensive is it? The real picture, not the document. I said, the document is accurate. He said, I know the document is accurate. I'm asking if the document is complete. I looked at him. He was looking at the chamber, at the empty seats, at the translation infrastructure overhead, at the far wall where the Navari block usually sat. I said, no. He was quiet for a moment. He nodded again, very slightly, and went back to his seat at the main table to wait. The rest of the recess I spent going over nothing, because there was nothing left to go over. The document was in the room. The room had read it. What happened next was not something I could influence by reviewing my notes. I sat with the remainder of the not quite tea, and I looked at the empty seats and I thought about the resolute margin, sitting at the edge of the system, not visible from here, not visible on any sensor grid the conclave was running, just there. 4,000 people, 4 combat wings. A weapon suite that made the vessel one of the most capable things currently operating in this region of space. She had not moved. She would not move unless I sent a signal that I had no intention of sending, because the point was never to use her. The point was that she existed, and that I knew she existed, and that I had been in that chamber for 3 days knowing she existed, and had not mentioned it once. The room did not know she was there. The document had not mentioned her. The document had not needed to. When Savith reconvened the session, she did not return to the vote. She did not move to rescind it. What she did was announce that, given new material entered into the session record, the formal instrument of transfer would be withheld, pending a review of the documentation by all member delegations. The review period was set at 90 days. She did not say what would follow the review. She did not say whether the vote stood or was suspended, or was simply paused in the administrative sense. So that means everyone has agreed to pretend the thing has not yet fully happened. What she said at the close of the announcement was, the Terran delegation is acknowledged for the submission. That was all. The Navari representative requested a private consultation with the Terran delegation, which Mossbank agreed to, and which took place the following morning in a conference room on the commercial deck where the atmospheric additive was calibrated differently, sharper, not pleasant. Cassie Het brought 2 colleagues and a legal advisor. Mossbank brought me and Trell. The conversation lasted 4 hours. I will not reproduce it in full because parts of it remain classified, and because Trell would be unhappy if I summarized his legal analysis publicly, which it deserves. What I can tell you is that the shape of the conversation was, we know what you have, they know that we know what they have, and the question of what to do with that mutual knowledge is one that every professional at the table understood could not be resolved with anything other than paper and time. The alternative was a room of 12 navies whose primary weapon systems were of uncertain provenance, which was not a stable condition for anyone. Cass Ehet at one point said, in Ketheron Standard, something I have thought about many times since. She said, "You have been in this room for longer than you appeared to be." I said, "Yes," she said. "The first contact then was not today." I said, "That depends on how you define it." She was quiet for a moment, the Navari quality of quiet that means active processing rather than absence. Then she said, in a tone I would describe as genuine and without resentment, or as close to those qualities as the Navari register allows, "We did not define it correctly." I said, "No, but you are not the first." The Cathara Accords were signed 19 days later. They are short and simple, standards of interspecies agreements, which is what happens when both parties understand that the complexity lives in what is not written down. Humanity remained an associate, not a managed resource. The managed resource language was struck entirely. In exchange, and this is the part that required most of Trell's time, a framework was established for what the document called technical infrastructure transparency, which meant that the program I have described would be wound down over a decade and replaced with openly negotiated, technical partnerships that served both parties under documented terms. I do not know how completely it has been wound down. That question is above my current clearance. What I know is that the accords held. 11 years on, they are still in force. Mossbank was right about that. The cold kind of treaty holds, because neither party wants to revisit the moment at which it was created. There is a stability in mutual knowledge that is different from the stability of affection or alliance. It is not warm. It does not require trust. It requires only that both parties understand, continuously, what the other one knows, and that the cost of disruption exceeds the benefit. The accords provide that. They have provided it for 11 years. I flew back to the Resolute Margin on the same nondescript shuttle I had arrived on. The carrier was exactly where it had been, holding at the outer edge of the Cathara system, running quietly, not visible on the Conclave's sensor grid. She was a big ship, blocky, squared off at the bow, with a flight deck that ran almost the full length of her dorsal surface and gun emplacements along her flanks, that the official recognition documents significantly understated. Because the official recognition documents were written by people who understood the value of understating certain things. She carried 4,000 people and a loadout that the Conclave's analysts, I was reasonably confident, had never mapped with full accuracy. She had never decloaked. She had never activated a fire control system. She had held position for 4 days and done nothing except exist. And the Conclave had never known she was there. And I had never mentioned her, and that was exactly as it should have been. A carrier you have to use is a carrier you needed. A carrier that sits at the edge of a system while a woman with a data chit does the work is something else. It is a reminder, to yourself, of what is available if the work fails. It is a kind of confidence, the grounded kind, the kind that does not announce itself. I thought about all of that during the approach, watching her grow in the forward port as we closed the distance, her hull backlit by the Cathara primary, in a way that made the battle scarring along her midship section visible. Marks from an engagement in a system I will not name. 18 months prior, a different kind of meeting. She looked, as she always did from the approach, like something that had been built to last. The Conclave of 12 had voted to determine humanity's future, and what they had found, when they looked at the room they were sitting Sanson, was that the room itself was partially of our construction. The Navari's guns, the Dasic's drives, the Vorok's defenses. 31 years of presence in the infrastructure of every species that had sat at that table to decide we were worth. First contact, as I had told Cassihat, depends on how you define it. I have had a version of that conversation many times since, diplomats and analysts, and, twice, with members of the committee that eventually reviewed the program's origins. They would ask when I thought first contact had really occurred. I would give them the answer that fit their framework. A date, a system, a vassal designation. It was never a false answer. There were many first contacts. That is one of the things the program's architects had understood. If you distribute presence across 3 decades and 12 supply chains and 40 intermediary commercial entities, you do not have a first contact. Here, you have something closer to an atmosphere. Something the other party has been breathing before they knew it was there. I am not certain that was wise. I want to be clear about that too. I have spent 11 years thinking about the ethics of what I was part of, and I do not have a clean verdict. The argument for it is the one you have probably already constructed for yourself. We were small, we were new, the community we were entering was not disposed to treat newcomers as equals, and the alternative to distributed presence might have been something closer to what the managed resource vote was trying to achieve. The argument against is simpler and heavier, and I will leave it as a weight rather than spell it out, because the people who were there do not need it spelled out, and the people who were not should arrive at it themselves. What I can say is this. On the shuttle back to the margin, in the hour before docking, I found myself thinking about the look on Cassikit's face when she said we had been in the room longer than we appeared. It was not a hostile look. It was not comfortable either. It was the look of an entity updating a model, expanding the scope of what it had believed to be knowable about another civilization, and finding that the expansion required more room than the model had allowed for. I have thought about that look more than any other single moment of the 3 days at Cathara, including the vote, including the recess, including the 4 hours with Cassihat and her legal advisor. Because it was the moment when the first contact, the actual one, the one that mattered, happened. Not the shuttle docking, not the session beginning, not the data chit on the table. The moment when she looked at something, she thought she knew and understood that she had been looking at it wrong. Mossbank retired 2 years after the accords were signed. I attended the reception they gave him in a function room in the old Commerce Bureau building on Meridian Station. I stood near the back and watched people come to shake his hand. He caught my eye, looked once across the room and raised his glass slightly. And that was the only communication we needed. He died 4 years after that. A long illness, the kind that gives you time to finish your sentences, put the things you want said into the places where they will be found. And I went to the service and sat in the 3rd row and thought about his hands on his folio chamber at Cathara, completely still, while the vote was announced and the managed resource instrument was being prepared, and his entire career's work was being formally undone, and he had not moved a muscle. He had known, when he filed my assignment request over his staff's objections, approximately what was in the data chit, not the specifics, which were compartmented above his clearance. And he was genuine when he said he wanted a different read on the room, but he had known that the room had something in it, some piece of the picture that the conclave had not priced in, and he had brought me because he thought I was the person most likely to know where that piece was and what to do with it. He was right. He was, in my experience, usually right about the things that mattered. The last thing I want to say is this, because I think it is the part that tends to get lost when this account is told as a story about capability or leverage or intelligence work. What happened in that chamber was not its core about the weapon systems in the document. It was not about the technical manifest or the procurement chains or the 31 years of embedded presence. Those were the mechanism. The thing itself was simpler. For 3 days, 12 species sat in a room and made decisions about humanity's future, and they treated humanity's representative as furniture. They were not cruel about it. They were not, by their own frameworks, wrong about it. We were a small power, a new one, a species that had been present in the wider community for a generation without establishing the kind of track record that changes how a room weighs your interests. What they were doing was a natural function of the order the conclave represented. Large powers making decisions about smaller ones, with the smaller ones in its consent made implicit by the structure of associate membership. And then someone in the secondary seating tier stood up. Not to shout, not to threaten, not to make a speech. Just place a data chit on the table and wait, without moving, while the room read what was on it. What the room found, when they read it, was that the furniture had a very long memory, had been paying very careful attention for a very long time, and had been in the room in ways that none of them had mapped. I think that is what Cassie Het meant when she said the first contact was not today. She meant, we thought we were meeting you for the first time, and we were wrong. You were already here. You were in our ships. You were in our procurement records. You had been in the air. We were breathing in this room since before we built the room. Carrier holding at the edge of the system was not, I suspect, an accident of deployment scheduling. Someone had decided that she should be there. Not to be used, not to be revealed, but because presence is its own kind of language. And sometimes the most legible statement is simply, we are here, and we have been here, and we understand what that means even if you do not yet. I docked. I filed my initial report. I changed out of the suit I had worn for 4 days, and I sat in my cabin and I looked at the bulkhead, and the first contact went well. Not because we won something. Nothing was won that day or lost. The accords were a cold document, carefully balanced. The work of professionals who understood that the goal was not victory, but a floor. A minimum beneath which neither side would fall. That floor is held for 11 years, and I expect it will hold for longer than I will be around to observe. But first contact, the real thing, the moment a civilization looks at another and has to revise what it believed, is not always a ship decloaking. It is not always a weapon fired or a fleet revealed. Sometimes it is a woman in a secondary seat at a trade table, placing a data chit in front of the chair and saying, quietly, in imperfect Catherine standard, I have something you should read before this session closes, and then waiting, without moving, while the room understands what it has been sitting in. That is what it was at Cathara. That is what first contact was.